Winter, 1887. Leadville, Colorado. 10,200 feet above sea level, where the air cuts like a blade and chimneys crack under the weight of ice. The most experienced builder in Lake County stood in front of the town council and said 5 words that should have ended everything. That chimney will kill her. Clayton Merrick had built 73 structures in the Rockies. He knew stone, mortar, draft, and fire. And he knew that what Emma Hartwell was planning violated every principle of safe construction. But here's what nobody understood yet. She wasn't building a chimney. She was building a survival system. And when the blizzard of January 1888 hit, the difference between her design and everyone else's wouldn't be measured in comfort. It would be measured in degrees, in hours, and whether you woke up on day 11 or didn't wake up at all. Today, you're going to understand why the worst idea became the most copied solution in the High Rockies. You're going to see the measurements that silenced every expert, and you're going to learn a principle that worked when life depended on it. If you want to receive one real survival technique every week, techniques that save lives when there was no second chance, hit that subscribe button right now, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Let's build a community of people who understand that old wisdom isn't primitive, it's proven. Now let me take you back to a cabin at the edge of survival. Emma Hartwell wasn't supposed to be here. 34 years old, former schoolteacher from Chester County, Pennsylvania, trained in literature and arithmetic, not stone and fire. But mining accidents don't care about plans. Her husband, Daniel, died in a cave-in at the Little Johnny mine in March of 1887, and by June she'd made a choice. Sell everything back east, buy land near Leadville, and prove she could survive a Rockies winter alone. She had $1,100, a teaching certificate nobody in Lake County cared about, and a piece of land at 10,400 feet where the ground froze solid by October. The problem showed itself the first week. Every cabin she visited, every single structure between Leadville and Twin Lakes, had the same design. External chimney, stone or brick built against the outer wall, rising above the roofline. It was the standard, the right way, the way experienced builders had done it for 20 years. And every single one of them failed the same way. November cold would hit, temperatures dropping to 15 below, and the external chimneys would start their slow betrayal. Ice formed inside the flue. Wind gusts at 60 miles per hour created backdraft that sent smoke pouring into cabins. Mortar cracked, stone shifted, and when the heavy snows came, 30, 40 inches in a single storm, chimneys collapsed under the weight, leaving families with no heat source in the deadliest cold of the year. Emma watched a neighbor, Samuel Cook, spend 4 hours in 20 below temperatures trying to chip ice out of his chimney flue. She watched the Dietrich family abandon their cabin for 3 days because smoke filled every room and they couldn't clear the blockage. She watched a well-built external chimney on the Patterson Place crack vertically during a cold snap, rendering it useless until spring. The system didn't work. Everyone knew it, but it was the system, so everyone kept building it. Emma decided to break the pattern. Her solution was specific: build the chimney inside the cabin, not against an interior wall, through the center. Create a massive stone column that would run from foundation to roof, surrounded by thermal mass, acting as both flue and radiator. Protect it from wind. Let it absorb heat. Let it give that heat back slowly for hours after the fire died. It made perfect sense to her. The chimney wouldn't freeze because it was inside. The draft would stay strong because the flue was warm. And the stone column would radiate heat in all directions, turning the chimney itself into a heating system. But it violated every rule the mountain builders lived by. It took up interior space, precious, limited space in a small cabin. It required unconventional stone stacking, a spiral draft design she'd sketched based on a pottery kiln diagram from a book. It demanded a mortar mix nobody in Leadville used, standard lime mortar blended with wood ash and local clay for flexibility during freeze-thaw cycles. When she explained it to the supply yard manager, he looked at her like she'd asked for wings. When she hired 2 laborers to help with the foundation, they quit after 3 days, saying the design didn't make sense. When she brought her drawings to the town's informal building review, not required by law, But expected by custom, Clayton Merrick stood up and said it would fail. Publicly. Definitively. But Emma had done the math. She'd calculated thermal mass. She'd studied convection. And more than that, she'd watched good people suffer through a system that didn't work, simply because nobody had questioned it. So she kept building. And the question that would define that winter was simple. Did she understand something about heat, stone, and survival that 20 years of mountain experience had missed? Or was she about to make a fatal mistake at 10,000 feet, alone, with no margin for error? Let me show you exactly what she built because the details matter. Emma's chimney wasn't a chimney in the conventional sense. It was a thermal core. Picture this, a stone column, 4 feet by 4 feet at the base, rising 18 feet from foundation to roof peak, positioned dead center in a 16 by 24-foot cabin. The column wasn't solid. It contained the flue, yes, but it was built with a double-wall design. Inner wall, fire brick and heat-resistant stone forming the actual flue passage, 8 inches in diameter, creating the draft. Outer wall, granite and schist, dense stone from the local quarry, chosen specifically for thermal mass. Between those two walls, a 2-inch air gap. That gap was the key. As hot air rose through the flue, it heated the inner wall. The inner wall radiated heat into the air gap. The air gap transferred the heat to the outer stone wall. And the outer wall, nearly 3,000 pounds of dense rock, absorbed it, held it, and released it slowly over 6 to 8 hours. The entire column became a heat battery. But here's what made builders like Clayton Merrick call it dangerous. The installation sequence violated standard practice. Emma didn't build the chimney first and cabin around it. She built the foundation with integrated stone piers, then constructed the column and cabin walls simultaneously, interlocking them. The chimney wasn't attached to the structure. It was part of the structure, load-bearing, supporting roof beams. This meant if the column failed, the cabin failed. She also used a spiral draft design. Instead of a straight vertical flue, the passage curved slightly, wrapping around the interior of the column in a gentle helix. This increased surface contact between hot gases and stone, maximizing heat transfer before exhaust left the building. In her mortar mix, this is what really irritated the experts, wasn't pure lime mortar. She blended it 3-to-1 with wood ash and bentonite clay she'd found near a creek bed. The ash provided microscopic air pockets for insulation. The clay gave flexibility, allowing slight expansion and contraction during freeze-thaw cycles without cracking. Nobody in Leadville used that mix. It looked wrong. It set slower. It felt weaker. But Emma wasn't building for strength alone. She was building for thermal performance and durability under temperature extremes. Now here's where it gets controversial. The stone selection seemed random. She used granite, schist, some sandstone, even chunks of quartzite. Experienced masons would never mix stone types like that. It created unpredictable expansion rates, potential failure points. Except Emma wasn't being careless. She was being precise. She tested each stone type with fire and cold water, watching how they absorbed and released heat. Granite held heat longest. Schist heated fastest. Sandstone provided mid-range performance. By layering them strategically, fast-heating stone near the firebox, slow-releasing stone in the upper column, she created a staged thermal release system. The column would warm quickly when the fire started, then sustain that warmth long after flames died. She maintained an 8-inch clearance between the stone column and any wooden framing, filling that gap with sand for additional fireproofing. She built an ash cleanout at the base, accessible from outside through a small iron door. She positioned the firebox opening to radiate heat toward the sleeping area and work table. And she included something no external chimney had: maintenance access points. Small stone panels that could be removed to inspect the flue, clean creosote, or repair damage without tearing down the entire structure. But Clayton Merrick didn't see innovation. He saw risk. That column will crack in the first hard freeze, he told her directly. Thermal expansion will rip it apart. You're mixing stone types that expand at different rates. It's a fracture waiting to happen. You're creating a fire risk triple what a proper external chimney has, he added at the town meeting. Wood framing 8 inches from heat source? Sand as your fireproofing? One spark, one structural shift, and your cabin burns with you inside it. And even if it doesn't crack or burn, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, the draft will fail. That spiral design will create turbulence, kill your draw, and you'll suffocate in your own smoke by December. The cost argument came last. You'll spend more repairing that experiment than you would have spent building 2 proper chimneys. And when it fails, not if, when, you'll have to tear it out and start over. Except you'll be doing it in winter with no heat source, which means you won't be doing it at all. The social judgment was quieter but sharper. A woman doesn't understand load-bearing principles, someone said at the supply yard. Emma heard it secondhand. This isn't a cabin, it's a science experiment, a neighbor told another neighbor, who told Emma's one friend in town, who kept it to herself, but Emma knew anyway. Real mountain folk don't need tricks to survive winter, Samuel Cook said, not unkindly, but firm. We just build solid and burn enough wood. That's how it's done. What none of them saw, what Emma couldn't make them see until it was too late to matter, was that she wasn't trying to prove cleverness. She was trying not to freeze to death. And whether her central thermal column would save her life or end it would be decided by something nobody could control, the weather. Clayton Merrick wasn't a cruel man. That's important to understand. 51 years old, master mason, built his first chimney at 15 in Cornwall, England, came to Colorado in 1867 and survived 20 Rockies winters through skill, caution, and respect for principles proven over centuries. He built structures that stood through earthquakes, fires, floods. When he said something was dangerous, people listened because he was usually right. So when Emma Hartwell presented her design at the Informal Town Building Review in September 1887, Clayton didn't dismiss it out of politeness and then gossip later. He opposed it formally, publicly, because he genuinely believed it would kill her. The meeting took place in the back room of the Leadville Mercantile, 15 people present, most of them men who built or repaired structures for a living. Emma brought her drawings, detailed sketches showing the column cross-section, stone layering, mortar composition, draft pathway, clearances, and load distribution. Clayton studied them for 11 minutes without speaking. Then he stood. Miss Hartwell, I respect your effort here. I see you've thought about this. But I need to tell you, as someone who's built 73 structures in this territory, that this design violates fundamental principles of safe construction. He pointed to the cross-section. That column will crack in the first hard freeze. You're using mixed stone types, granite, schist, sandstone, quartzite, each with different thermal expansion coefficients. When temperatures drop to 20, 30 below, those stones will expand and contract at different rates. The column will fracture, and when it fractures, your flue opens to your living space. You'll have smoke, carbon monoxide, and no way to vent it safely. Emma started to respond, but he continued. Even if the stone holds, and I don't believe it will, your mortar mix is experimental. Lime mortar with wood ash and clay? That's not proven in freeze-thaw cycles at this altitude. Standard lime mortar has a 200-year track record. What you're proposing has a 0-year track record. You're gambling your life on an untested material in an environment where failure means death. Someone in the back, a carpenter named Horace Penfield, added his concern. The fire risk alone is unacceptable. You've got wood framing 8 inches from a stone mass that'll be radiating heat constantly. Sand as your fireproofing? That's not enough. One structural shift, one settlement, and you've got direct heat contact with timber. Your cabin will burn in under an hour. Clayton wasn't finished. And this spiral draft design, he tapped the drawing, will create turbulence that kills your draw. Smoke needs a straight, unobstructed path to vent efficiently. Every curve, every angle disrupts laminar flow. You'll get backdraft. You'll get smoke accumulation. And in January, when you need that fire most, you'll be forced to choose between freezing or suffocating. He looked at her directly. I've seen people die in these mountains from overconfidence, from thinking they understood principles better than 2 centuries of building tradition. I've buried 3 men who tried to innovate their way through winter. Please don't become the 4th. The room was silent. Emma kept her voice steady. Mr. Merrick, I understand your concerns. But external chimneys fail here every winter. I've watched them crack, ice over collapse. The proven system isn't working. It works, Clayton replied, if you build it correctly and maintain it properly. The failures you've seen are from poor construction or neglect, not from the design itself. The Dietrich chimney was built correctly, Emma said. You inspected it yourself last year. It still filled their cabin with smoke for 3 days in November. Because ice blocked the flue, Clayton countered. Which happens. You clear it and move on. But ice won't form in an interior chimney? You think that solves the problem? The smoke has to exit somewhere. You still have an exterior cap exposed to weather. Ice will form there, block your vent, and then you've got all the same problems plus a 3,000-pound stone column that might crack under thermal stress. Horace spoke again. Miss Hartwell, forgive me, but do you have experience with load-bearing masonry? With calculating structural stress under variable temperature conditions? Because this design requires precision that, no offense intended, most people, even experienced builders, don't have. The implication was clear. A woman, especially one with no construction background, couldn't possibly understand the engineering required. Emma felt it, the subtle condescension wrapped in concern. But she also felt something else, certainty. She'd done the calculations. She'd tested the materials. And she'd watched the correct system fail repeatedly. I'll stake my life on it, she said quietly. That's exactly what you're doing, Clayton replied. And I'm asking you not to. But the decision wasn't his to make. There were no building codes in Lake County in 1887, no permits required for private structures on private land. The review was advisory, not binding. Emma could build whatever she wanted. She thanked them for their input. She rolled up her drawings. And she left. Behind her, the conversation continued. She won't make it through January, someone said. She'll abandon the cabin before Christmas, another predicted. If she's smart, Horace muttered, she'll hire someone to rebuild it properly after the first cold snap proves Merrick right. Clayton Merrick didn't say anything. He just looked at Emma's drawings one more time, shook his head slowly, and hoped, genuinely hoped, that he was wrong. But he'd been building in the Rockies for 20 years. And in 20 years, he'd never been wrong about structural failure. Until now, January 3rd, 1888. The temperature in Leadville at sunrise, 12 degrees Fahrenheit. By noon 8. By sunset, -2, with wind gusts hitting 40 miles per hour out of the northwest. That was just a warning. January 4th brought the real cold. -18 at dawn. -26 by midnight. The kind of cold that turns breath to ice crystals before it dissipates, that makes metal tools too painful to hold, that cracks green timber with sounds like rifle shots. And on January 5th, the snow started. Not the light, dry powder that blows and drifts. Heavy, wet snow that fell thick and relentless. 4 inches in the first hour, 8 by nightfall, 14 by the next morning. The kind of snow that buries paths, collapses poorly built roofs, and traps people in their cabins for days. By January 7th, Leadville and the surrounding settlements were cut off. No mail, no supply wagons, no way in or out until the storm broke and crews could clear the passes. And the temperature kept dropping. -31 on January 8th, -35 on January 9th. On the morning of January 10th, Samuel Cook's outdoor thermometer read -38 degrees Fahrenheit, the coldest temperature he'd recorded in 6 years at elevation. This was the test nobody wanted, but everyone knew was coming. External chimneys began failing within 48 hours. The Dietrich chimney, the one Clayton Merrick had inspected and approved, developed ice blockage on January 6th. Martin Dietrich spent 2 hours trying to clear it with a pole and heated wire, but the ice reformed faster than he could remove it. Smoke backed into the cabin. They had to let the fire die, which meant no heat source in -20-degree conditions. They lasted 6 hours before abandoning the cabin and moving in with neighbors half a mile away, struggling through thigh-deep snow in the dark. The Patterson chimney, rebuilt in October with fresh mortar, cracked vertically on January 8th when the temperature hit -35. The crack opened wide enough to see daylight through it. The family kept the fire burning small, afraid a hot fire would split the chimney completely, but small fires meant inadequate heat. Their cabin interior dropped to 34 degrees. They burned through their wood reserve in 3 days, trying to stay warm enough to survive. Samuel Cook's chimney didn't crack, but ice formed in the flue cap and created a partial blockage that sent smoke into the cabin every time wind gusts hit. He couldn't clear it. The ice was 20 feet up in sub-zero conditions. He kept burning wood, kept breathing smoke, and hoped the storm would break before his wood pile ran out or the smoke overwhelmed his lungs. 11 families within 5 miles of Emma's cabin faced some version of the same crisis. Failing heat sources, dwindling wood supplies, dangerous cold, and no way to get help. Emma Hartwell was alone. Her cabin sat quarter-mile from the nearest neighbor, accessible only by a footpath that was now under 36 inches of snow. She had an estimated 9 to 10 days of split firewood under the cabin's covered porch, enough for a standard external chimney system if used carefully, but she didn't know if it would be enough for her untested design. On January 6th, she burned a normal fire and watched her system carefully. The stone column warmed slowly but steadily. By evening, she could place her hand on the outer stone and feel heat radiating 4 feet into the cabin. On January 7th, the heavy snow arrived and temperatures crashed. She burned a larger fire. The stone absorbed it. The flue drew cleanly, no smoke backup. The cabin interior stayed at 58 degrees, even as the outside temperature hit minus 26. On January 8th, she ran an experiment. She let the fire die completely at noon, then monitored the interior temperature. At 6 p.m., 6 hours after the last flame, the cabin was still 53 degrees. The stone column radiated warmth through the entire space. She rebuilt the fire and used less wood than the night before. On January 9th, minus 35 outside, she burned a moderate fire from dawn until evening, let it die to coals overnight, and woke on January 10th to a cabin interior of 49 degrees. Her wood supply was holding. The system was working, but nobody knew. Quarter-mile away, through snow and cold, Samuel Cook was breathing smoke and burning wood at twice the rate Emma was using. The Dietrich family was crowding another family's cabin, straining their host's resources. The Pattersons were rationing fire and shivering under blankets. By January 11th, rescue attempts began to fail. A group of men tried to reach the Patterson cabin with additional wood, but turned back after 200 yards. Wind, cold, and snow made it impossible. Another attempt to check on Emma's cabin got within sight of her chimney, smoke rising clean and steady, but couldn't reach the door. On January 13th, the storm finally broke. Temperature rose to minus 12. Wind died. Sunlight appeared for the first time in 8 days. And on January 14th, rescue crews reached the outlying cabins. They found the Dietrich cabin abandoned, cold, dark. They found the Patterson family alive, but hypothermic, burning their furniture to stay warm, wood supply exhausted 3 days earlier. They found Samuel Cook weak, coughing, his cabin reeking of smoke. And then they reached Emma Hartwell's cabin. Stay with me, because the measurement that came out of this storm silenced every critic in Lake County. If this story is showing you something about survival engineering that modern construction ignores, hit that like button. And if you want to see how this changed an entire region's building practices, subscribe, because the next chapter is where the numbers proved everything. Drop a comment too. I want to know, where are you watching from, and what's the coldest winter you've ever faced? When a rescue crew knocked on Emma's door on January 14th, she answered it immediately. She was baking bread. The interior temperature of her cabin was 64 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, minus 12. The crew stood in the doorway, staring at a woman in a cotton dress working at a table, flour on her hands, bread in a Dutch oven sitting on the stone hearth, the massive central column radiating heat you could feel from 6 feet away. One of the men, Horace Penfield, the carpenter who'd questioned her design, said 6 words, "How is this even possible?" Emma wiped flour from her hands and smiled. Physics, thermal mass, and about 40% less wood than you've been burning. She let them inside. They circled the stone column, placing their hands on it, feeling heat that would continue radiating for another 4 hours, even if she never lit another fire. They examined the flue. No ice, no smoke damage, clean draw. They check her wood supply. 5 days worth remaining. They calculated 11 days of storm, and she had enough fuel left to run almost another week at the same rate. Horace did the math out loud. You're burning roughly half what we are. Less than half, Emma corrected. And the cabin never dropped below 48 degrees, even when I let the fire die completely overnight. The comparison was undeniable, brutal, embarrassing for every builder who'd oppose her. While neighbors froze at 31 degrees, burned through reserves in 3 days, abandoned cabins, or risked smoke inhalation, Emma Hartwell had maintained a comfortable, safe, livable environment using a system everyone had called dangerous, wasteful, and doomed to fail. The numbers don't lie. But we'll look at those numbers in detail next, because when you see the actual measurements, you'll understand why Clayton Merrick came back 3 days later and said 5 words he'd never said before in 20 years. I was wrong. You weren't. Numbers don't care about pride. They don't care about tradition. They don't care about who built what or who learned from whom. They just tell the truth. And on January 14th, 1888, when the rescue crews finished checking every cabin within 5 miles of Leadville, the truth was written in temperatures, wood consumption, and survival outcomes that nobody could argue with. Let me show you exactly what they measured. Emma Hartwell's cabin interior. 11 days into the blizzard, fire burning moderately, 64 degrees Fahrenheit. Her neighbors, using traditional external chimneys, burning fires as large as they dared. Average interior temperature of 31 degrees. That's a 33-degree difference. That's the difference between working in comfort and shivering under every blanket you own. But temperature is just the beginning. Wood consumption told a deeper story. Samuel Cook burned through his entire winter reserve, approximately 2 cords of split pine and aspen, in 9 days. The Patterson family exhausted their supply in 8 days and started burning furniture on day 9. Martin Dietrich abandoned his cabin on day 2, but later estimates suggested his rate of consumption would have depleted his reserves in 7 days maximum. Emma used roughly 42% of the wood her neighbors burned over the same period. She started the storm with an estimated 9 to 10 days of fuel. On day 14, she still had 5 days worth remaining. The math is simple. She could have lasted 19 days at the same consumption rate while her neighbors were running out in 8. But here's what makes those numbers even more significant. She wasn't rationing. She wasn't huddling in one corner trying to survive. She maintained a livable, functional temperature throughout the entire cabin. The rescue crew documented heat retention with a simple test. At 2 p.m. on January 14th, Emma extinguished her fire completely. No coals, no embers, just stone. They placed a hand thermometer on the cabin's center table and monitored it every 30 minutes. 2:30 p.m., 61 degrees. 3 p.m., 58 degrees. 3:30 p.m., 56 degrees. 4 p.m., 54 degrees. 4:30 p.m., 52 degrees. 5 p.m., 51 degrees. 6 hours after the fire died, the cabin was still above 50 degrees. The stone column continued radiating stored heat long after a traditional fireplace would have gone cold. In neighboring cabins with external chimneys, interior temperatures dropped to near freezing within 45 minutes of the fire dying. That's not a minor difference. That's the difference between waking up to rekindled warmth or waking up to death. Horace Penfield, the carpenter who'd questioned her design publicly, ran his own comparison. He measured the surface temperature of Emma's stone column at multiple points: 78 degrees at chest height, 82 degrees near the base, 69 degrees at shoulder height. Then he walked to Samuel Cook's cabin and measured the external chimney. Exterior surface temperature, 14 degrees. No heat retention, no radiant warming. Just a conduit for smoke that offered nothing back to the living space. The structural integrity check came next. Clayton Merrick arrived on January 16th, 2 days after the storm broke, and inspected Emma's column with the thoroughness of a man hoping to find vindication. He checked every joint, every stone interface, every mortar line. He looked for cracks, shifts, separations, any sign that thermal expansion had compromised the structure. He found none. The mixed stone types, granite, schist, sandstone, quartzite, had expanded and contracted at different rates, yes. But the flexible mortar mix, the one he'd called experimental and unproven, had absorbed those stresses. The 2-inch air gap between inner and outer walls had provided expansion room. The interlock construction had distributed loads evenly. The column was solid, uncracked, fully functional after 11 days of extreme thermal cycling between minus 38 degrees outside and 60 plus inside. Clayton ran his hand along the stonework and said nothing for a long time. Then he checked the flue. No creosote buildup. The warm draft had kept combustion efficient. No ice formation in the cap. The interior positioning and thermal mass had prevented it. No smoke staining on the interior stones. The spiral draft design had maintained clean, complete combustion throughout. Emma stood to the side, arms crossed, watching him work. She didn't gloat. She didn't lecture. She just waited. When Clayton finally spoke, his voice was quieter than anyone had ever heard it. Your draft is stronger than mine. Your heat retention is, I don't have a comparison. And your wood efficiency is roughly 60% better than standard construction. He looked at her directly. I said this would fail. I said it publicly, formally, with full confidence. I was wrong. But the most powerful measurement wasn't temperature or wood consumption or structural integrity. It was something simpler. Emma Hartwell was baking bread on day 11 while families 3 cabins away were burning furniture to avoid freezing. That image, a woman in a cotton dress, flour on her hands, working in comfort while neighbors suffered, spread through Lake County faster than the original criticism ever had. By January 20th, 7 men had visited Emma's cabin to see the column for themselves. By January 25th, a farmer named Jacob Brenner from 12 miles south had sketched the design and asked permission to replicate it. By February 1st, builders in Leadville were asking questions Clayton Merrick couldn't answer because he hadn't built it. So they asked Emma instead. And the question that defined the next year wasn't, will this work? Anymore. It was, how do we build one? The measurements had proven the system. The blizzard had tested it under the worst possible conditions. And the result, 33 degrees warmer, half the wood, 6 hours of heat retention after the fire died, structural integrity maintained, clean draft preserved, 0 failures, was undeniable. Clayton Merrick had been building in the Rockies for 20 years. He knew stone, fire, and survival. And on January 16, 1888, he learned that 20 years of experience isn't the same as understanding principles. Emma Hartwell hadn't built a better chimney. She built a thermal survival system based on physics, not tradition. And when tradition failed across Lake County, physics kept her alive. The proof wasn't in arguments or authority. It was in degrees, hours, and with consumption measured under conditions that separated survival from death. And once those numbers were public, everything changed. Clayton Merrick didn't visit Emma's cabin to apologize. He came because he needed to understand how he'd been wrong. January 16th, late afternoon, he knocked on her door with a notebook, a measuring tape, and the kind of humility that 20 years of certainty makes almost impossible to access. Miss Hartwell, he said when she answered, I'd like your permission to study what you've built. Not to criticize, to learn. She stepped aside and let him in. For 2 hours, he measured, sketched, and asked questions. Stone dimensions, mortar ratios, air gap width, flue diameter, draft angle, thermal mass calculations. He didn't defend his original position. He didn't qualify his criticism with excuses. He just listened, measured, and wrote. At one point, he placed his hand on the column and held it there for 30 seconds, feeling heat radiating from stone that hadn't seen direct flame in 6 hours. A measured heat, he said quietly, almost to himself. A measured draft. A measured structural load. But I never measured what heat could do if you stored it instead of just venting it. Emma nodded. The chimney isn't the system. The column is the system. The chimney is just part of it. Clayton wrote that down. Before he left, he said 5 words that reset his reputation and hers. I was wrong. You weren't. He didn't say it privately. He said it at the Leadville Mercantile 3 days later, in front of 14 people, the same room where he'd opposed her design publicly 4 months earlier. I evaluated Emma Hartwell's chimney design as dangerous and unworkable, he told them. I was wrong on both counts. Her system outperformed every traditional structure in this area during the January storm. It's not just functional, it's superior. And if anyone here is planning new construction, I recommend you study what she's built before you break ground. That statement, from Clayton Merrick, carried more weight than any demonstration Emma could have organized herself. It wasn't a woman defending an untested idea anymore. It was the region's most respected builder admitting that traditional methods had failed and a new approach had succeeded. The adoptions started immediately. Jacob Brenner, the farmer from 12 miles south, began construction on a modified version in late January. He used Emma's core principles: central thermal column, double wall design, mixed stone types, flexible mortar, but adapted the dimensions for a larger family cabin. By March, his structure was complete. By the following winter, he reported similar results: 48% reduction in wood consumption, stable interior temperatures, no structural issues. In Leadville proper, a mining company building new bunkhouses consulted Emma on thermal column design for structures housing 20 men. They couldn't replicate her exact system. Scale made it impractical, but they incorporated the core principle: interior thermal mass that absorbed and radiated heat rather than just venting it. By late spring 1888, 17 cabins within 50 miles had incorporated some version of Emma's central column design. Not all of them were exact replicas. Some used different stone types based on local availability. Some modified the air gap width. Some adjusted the spiral draft angle. But all of them followed the fundamental insight: stop treating the chimney as just a smoke vent and start treating it as a heat storage and distribution system. Local variations emerged naturally. A builder near Breckenridge used limestone instead of granite, more abundant in his area, and found it worked nearly as well with slight adjustments to the mortar mix. A family in Aspen added a cooking surface integration, routing the flue past a flat stone platform that functioned as a stovetop. A trapper building a small winter shelter reduced the column size but increased the stone density, creating a compact version that still delivered 70% of Emma's heat retention. The technique spread through practical demonstration, not promotional effort. People saw results. They asked questions. They adapted the design to their needs. And within 2 years, the Hartwell column, a term Emma never used herself, but one that stuck in local builder vernacular, became a standard recommendation for high-altitude construction in Colorado's mining territories. It reached beyond Lake County. Builders in Summit County heard about it from miners who'd worked in Leadville. Families relocating to high-elevation homesteads asked about it specifically. By 1890, variations of the central thermal chimney system had appeared in structures across the Rockies, from southern Colorado to Montana, each adapted to local materials, climate conditions, and building traditions, but all rooted in the same principle Emma had proven in January 1888. The cultural shift wasn't just technical, it was philosophical. For 20 years, mountain builders had followed a single approach: external chimneys, maximum draft, high wood consumption, accept the cold, survive through endurance. Emma's success demonstrated that survival wasn't about endurance alone. It was about understanding thermodynamics, material properties, and energy efficiency. She hadn't just built a better cabin. She'd challenged the assumption that traditional methods were inherently superior to innovative ones. And when the crisis came, the brutal test that separated functional systems from failed ones, innovation won. By 1891, Clayton Merrick was incorporating thermal mass principles into his own designs. Not full Hartwell columns. His clients often wanted more traditional aesthetics, but hybrid systems. External chimneys with interior stone backing, heat-absorbing walls positioned near fireboxes, improved mortar mixes that handled freeze-thaw cycles better. He never took credit for Emma's innovation. He cited her by name in consultations. And when younger builders asked him about high-efficiency heating systems, he told them the same thing: go talk to Emma Hartwell. She understood it before I did. The social judgment that had questioned whether a woman could understand load-bearing principles or thermal engineering didn't disappear entirely. Attitudes shift slowly, but it lost its power. Because when you're standing in a cabin that's 33 degrees warmer than your neighbors, using half the wood, with a system that survived the worst blizzard in 6 years without a single structural failure, the question isn't, could a woman have designed this? The question is, why didn't we figure this out sooner? Emma didn't become famous. She didn't patent the design or charge for consultations. She answered questions when people asked, shared measurements when builders wanted data, and continued living in her cabin, comfortably, efficiently, safely, through 17 more winters before she eventually moved to Denver in 1905. But her influence outlasted her presence. The Hartwell column, in various forms, remained a feature of high-altitude construction in the Rockies well into the 20th century. Some structures built in the 1890s using her principles were still functional in the 1950s, their thermal mass systems still outperforming modern alternatives in terms of wood efficiency and heat retention. The lesson wasn't about chimneys. It was about principles. Traditional methods work until they don't. Authority is useful until it prevents innovation. And survival, real survival, the kind that keeps you alive when the temperature hits -38 and the snow buries everything for 11 days, requires understanding how systems work, not just following how they've always been built. Emma Hartwell wasn't being stubborn when she built her central thermal column. She wasn't trying to prove expertise. She was being practical. She saw a system that failed repeatedly, studied the physics of why it failed, designed a solution that addressed those failure points, and tested it under conditions where mistakes meant death. She survived. Her neighbors suffered. And the difference between those outcomes wasn't luck or endurance. It was engineering. So here's my question for you. Which part of Emma's solution would you apply in your home today? Would you prioritize thermal mass, materials that store and release heat slowly? Would you rethink where your heat source is positioned? Would you question whether the standard approach is actually the most efficient approach? Drop your answer in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from and what the coldest winter you've ever faced was. And if this story showed you that old wisdom isn't about doing things the hard way, it's about understanding principles that still work when everything else fails, hit that subscribe button. Because every week, I bring you techniques like this. Real methods, tested under real conditions, used by people who didn't have second chances. The kind of knowledge that kept Emma Hartwell alive at 10,000 feet when everyone said her design would kill her. See you in the next one. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.